Find me a husband before midnight. If he's honest, I'll take him.
Find me a husband before midnight, she begged. No one realized the Duke was listening. There are things a woman says aloud only when she believes no one who matters is within earshot. Beatrice Calloway said hers at 11 o'clock on the night of Lady Fenwick's masquerade ball, standing in the shadow of an enormous potted fern in the east alcove of the second-floor gallery, believing herself entirely alone, addressing her prayer to the ceiling with the specific desperation of a woman who has run completely out of alternatives. Find me a husband before midnight, she said. Anyone. I am not particular. He must have a pulse and the basic arithmetic of 2 legs. That is the full extent of my requirements at this present moment. The fern did not respond. The man standing 3 feet behind it, however, went very still. She did not know he was there. This was important. If she had known that the person hearing her most honest prayer was Sebastian Cavendish, the Duke of Ashmore, a man so far above her social station that the distance between them was less a gap than an entire geography, she would have sunk directly through the floorboards and been grateful for the alternative. But she did not know. And so she continued. My father, she told the ceiling, has given me until the end of this season. She paused. He has been very clear. She paused again. He used the word ultimatum, which I believe is French for you are going to marry someone financially convenient or I will arrange it for you, and either way the result will be the same except in one version I have some say in the matter. The fern continued to offer no counsel. Beatrice Calloway was 23 years old, the eldest daughter of a baronet whose estate had been quietly dissolving for a decade the way old houses dissolve, slowly, in the walls, invisible until suddenly the entire structure is compromised. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubbornness and a face that a charitable observer would call striking and an uncharitable one would call unconventional, which in the language of the season meant she was interesting rather than pretty, and interesting was considerably harder to sell. She had survived 2 previous seasons on wit and deflection and the kindness of Lady Fenwick, who was her mother's oldest friend and had taken it upon herself to produce Beatrice into society with the determined optimism of a woman who believed that the right man was simply a matter of being in the right room at the right time. This was the right room. It was past the right time. And Beatrice was standing behind a fern talking to the ceiling. Anyone at all, she said, with the quiet finality of someone concluding a negotiation. A vicar. A second son. A man of business who has made a reasonable fortune and wants a wife who will manage his household without complaining. I can do that. I am very good at managing things without complaining. A beat of silence. I simply need someone to marry me before my father does it for me. The name he has in mind is Sir Phineas Grubb, and Sir Phineas Grubb is 64 years old and has buried 2 wives already, and I refuse to be the third. Not because I am above sacrifice but because he smells of camphor and addresses women as if we are moderately intelligent retrievers. The man behind the fern had, over the course of this speech, gone from still to frozen. He was wearing a black domino mask, it was a masquerade, and his identity was concealed in the way these things were always concealed at Lady Fenwick's balls, which was to say barely, since every person in the room knew exactly who everyone else was and the mask served primarily as permission to pretend otherwise. He was 33 years old. He was the 5th Duke of Ashmore. He had an estate in Derbyshire and a townhouse in Grosvenor Square and an income that would have solved Beatrice Calloway's father's financial difficulties approximately 4 times over with funds remaining. He had dark eyes behind the black domino mask and the kind of face that had been described in society columns as brooding so frequently that he had stopped reading society columns, and he had come to stand in this particular alcove because he had needed, for exactly 12 minutes, to be somewhere that was not the ballroom. He had not expected the fern to have company. He had not expected any of this. He stood very still for a moment after she finished speaking, processing the specific nature of what he had just heard, which was a woman, alone, in genuine distress, laying out her situation to an empty room with a clarity and a dry humor that he found, without planning to find anything at all, completely extraordinary. He should have left immediately. He knew this. He had not left immediately. And then Beatrice turned around. She saw him. The color that came into her face was immediate and total. She went from ivory to crimson in a single second, which was, he would think about later, quite technically impressive. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Calloway," he said. A silence of spectacular quality descended between them. "How long," she said, "have you been standing there?" It was not a question. It was a reckoning. He considered his options. He was not, by nature, a man who softened things. He was also not, by nature, a man who used other people's vulnerability against them. Both of these facts were simultaneously true and pointing in opposite directions. "Long enough," he said. She closed her eyes. She opened them. She looked at him with the expression of a woman performing a rapid internal audit of everything she had said and arriving at a figure she found completely catastrophic. "I would be very grateful," she said, with tremendous dignity, "if your Grace would forget everything he heard in the last 4 minutes." He said, "That will not be possible." She said, "I see." He said, "The camphor detail was particularly memorable." She pressed her lips together. The color in her face had not diminished. "I am going to walk away now," she said. "Please do not follow me. Please do not tell anyone what you heard. Please, if the universe contains any mercy whatsoever, forget that this happened entirely." She turned and walked back toward the ballroom with the upright, deliberate composure of a woman who is performing dignity so hard it has become its own armor. He watched her go. He stood in the alcove for a long moment after she disappeared through the gallery doors. And then, for the first time in a very long time, Sebastian Cavendish, Duke of Ashmore, found himself genuinely, helplessly interested in what happened next. He should not have followed her back into the ballroom. He told himself this firmly. He was a man of considerable self-discipline. He had navigated the London season for 11 years without allowing any of it to touch him particularly. He had been the subject of matchmaking efforts from mothers across 3 counties and had emerged from all of them with his freedom intact and his heart uninvested. He followed her back into the ballroom. He told himself he was simply returning to the party. This was technically true. It was also the most dishonest thing he had said in recent memory. Beatrice was already across the room, having been intercepted by Lady Fenwick, who was steering her toward a cluster of young men near the refreshment table with the bright purposeful energy of a woman who has committed to a project. Beatrice was smiling. The smile had the quality of something held in place by sheer force of will, technically present, fundamentally exhausted. He watched her from across the room and found he was reading the difference between the smile she wore in the ballroom and the voice she had used behind the fern. The ballroom smile was careful and social and performed with skill. The alcove voice had been dry and true and slightly desperate and entirely itself. He found he preferred the alcove voice by a considerable margin. He did not dance. He watched. He was aware this was not his best behavior. His friend, Viscount Harcourt, the only person in London whose opinion he genuinely weighted, appeared at his elbow with 2 glasses of champagne and the knowing expression of someone who has been watching a more entertaining scene than the one on the dance floor. "You have been looking at Miss Calloway for 20 minutes, Harcourt said. "I have been standing here for 20 minutes, the Duke said. "You have been standing here looking at Miss Calloway for 20 minutes. There is a distinction that matters." He accepted the champagne. "I overheard something I should not have." Harcourt raised an eyebrow. "Nothing scandalous, I hope. She seems a perfectly respectable young woman." It was not scandalous. He paused. It was honest. Harcourt looked at him. Honest how? Honest in the way that people are only honest when they believe no one is listening. He paused again. "She is running out of time," he said. "Her father has set a deadline. She was talking to a fern about it." A beat of silence. Harcourt said, "She was talking to a fern. In the east alcove, yes. About her marriage prospects." About the specific alternatives available to her and her objections to a man named Sir Phineas Grubb. Harcourt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with great care, "Seb. You are describing a woman in a genuinely difficult situation." "Yes. And you are looking at her in the manner of a man who has decided to become involved in it." He said nothing. Harcourt said, "You are aware that becoming involved in that situation has a fairly specific resolution. Given who you are." He said, "I am aware." Harcourt looked at him for a long moment. The ballroom moved around them. Across the room, Beatrice was being introduced to a man in a blue waistcoat who appeared immediately smitten and was already leaning toward her with the enthusiasm of someone who had not spent enough time considering whether the enthusiasm was welcome. He watched her face as the man in the blue waistcoat spoke. She was polite. She was gracious. She was exhausted underneath both. He set down his champagne glass. He crossed the room. He was aware, as he moved through the crowd and people parted for him in the automatic way they always parted for his particular title and face and the combined weight of both, that what he was doing was not retrievable. Once he stood beside her at a masquerade ball in front of all of London society, the conversation would start. He knew what conversations like that cost women. He was choosing to start it anyway. He wanted to be certain he was choosing it for the right reason. He was, he concluded, uncertain about his reasons. He was proceeding anyway. He arrived beside her. The man in the blue waistcoat stopped mid-sentence. "Miss Calloway," he said. She turned. Her face when she saw him was a study in the collision of composure and alarm. She managed something that was technically a social expression. "Your Grace," he said, with the full weight of his title doing its work in the background, "I believe this dance is mine." She had not promised him any dance. They both knew this. The man in the blue waistcoat retreated immediately, which was the practical function of a dukedom when deployed with intention. She took his arm because refusing it in front of 200 people was not an option she had. She said, very quietly, as he led her toward the floor, "What are you doing?" He said, "Dancing with you." She said, "Why?" He thought about this. "Because," he said, "I would like to speak to you without a fern between us." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a groan but contained the essential qualities of both. The waltz was a revelation. Not because she danced beautifully, though she did, with the precise, economical grace of someone who has been well taught and has genuinely good instincts. But because she was silent for the first 30 seconds of it in the particular silence of someone composing what they want to say, and then she said it. "You heard everything." "Yes." She said, "Everything including the part about Sir Phineas." "Especially that part," he said. A pause. They turned through the waltz. The chandelier light moved over them. She said, "You understand this is mortifying." He said, "I understand that it would feel that way. It does feel that way. It feels catastrophically that way." He said, "It shouldn't." She said, with respect, "Your Grace, you are a duke. You have never in your life been required to stand behind a fern and beg the universe for a husband." He said, "No. That is true." She looked at him. Really looked, the kind of look that is evaluating rather than performing. "Why are you here?" She said. "Why did you follow me into the ballroom? Why did you claim this dance? You have options. You have 20 women in this room who would accept you before you finished the sentence." He thought about this for a genuine moment before answering. "Because," he said, "I have spent 11 seasons in this room listening to women say things they thought I wanted to hear." "You said something true." He paused. "I find I have become considerably more interested in true things than I expected." She stared at him. The waltz continued. The room moved around them. She said, "That is either the most flattering thing anyone has ever said to me or the strangest." He said, "It may be both." She said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, what happens after the dance? He said, whatever you would like to happen. She said, that is not a useful answer when a woman has until midnight. He looked at her. The clock above the ballroom entrance showed 11:23. He said, then we should not waste the time. He did not propose at 11:23. He was not, despite what the gossip columns would later claim, a man who made irrevocable decisions on the floor of a masquerade ball after a single waltz and a conversation behind a potted fern. He was a man of considered judgment and deliberate action, and he had a very particular dislike of doing things that could not be undone. He asked her, instead, to walk with him on the gallery. The gallery ran the length of the second floor, overlooking the ballroom below through a series of arched openings. At this hour, most of the guests had returned to the floor. The gallery was nearly empty. The fern was still there, in its alcove, unmoved by recent events. She looked at it as they passed. I feel I owe it an apology, she said. He said, for what? She said, I said some rather personal things to it. It has maintained a very dignified silence about the whole affair. He said, unlike me. Unlike you, yes. They walked. The ballroom noise below them was a warm distant roar. The gallery was cooler and quieter and lit by candles in wall sconces that threw soft moving shadows across the plasterwork ceiling. She said, are you going to ask me something? He said, yes. She stopped walking. She turned and faced him with the directness of a woman who has spent too much of this year waiting for things to be said and has decided she will not spend one more unnecessary minute waiting. She said, then ask it. He said, why him? Grub. Why is that the alternative your father has chosen? She blinked. That was not what she had expected him to ask. She considered refusing to answer, and then considered that she was standing in a gallery with a duke who had heard her talking to a fern and the time for dignity as a strategy had passed. Sir Phineas has money, she said. His first 2 wives died without issue. He wants children and my father has assured him I am healthy and capable. She said this last part with the flat, precise tone of someone reading from a document they find offensive. My father's estate is in debt. Sir Phineas has offered to clear the debt in exchange for the arrangement. My father has until the 1st of June to accept or decline the offer. Tonight is the 15th of May. The Duke said nothing for a moment. He said, and you have no one else. She said, I have had offers. 2, in the last 2 years. Neither one, she stopped. Neither one was someone I could have managed a life with. I understand that is not a luxury most women in my position are afforded. I made my choices with open eyes. He said, what did you want? She looked at him. What did I want? In a husband. What were you looking for? Before the deadline made the question academic. A pause. The candles moved. Below them the waltz continued. She said, with the careful honesty of someone who does not say this out loud, someone who would find me interesting. Not manageable. Not convenient. Interesting. In the way you find a problem interesting, not because it is easy but because it is worth the effort. She said it to the middle distance, not to him. When she finished she seemed to realize she had said it at all and looked at him with the expression of someone braced for the next embarrassment. He was looking at her with the specific expression she had not yet seen on his face, the one without any of the composed public architecture. Just him, looking at her, having heard something that had arranged itself inside him in a way he had not anticipated and was not entirely prepared for. He said, how long until midnight? She looked at the clock visible at the far end of the gallery. 22 minutes, she said. He said, then I need you to hear something. She said, all right. He said, I have been in this city for 11 years. I have been the subject of approximately 40 serious attempts at my attentions and perhaps 100 less serious ones. He paused. Every single one of them was aimed at the dukedom. At Ashmore Park. At the income. He paused again. Not one of them has ever stood behind a fern and told me the truth about their situation. She said, that is because most women in my situation have more sense than I do. He said, no. He said it quietly and absolutely. It is because most women in your situation are trying to be what they think will work. You were, he paused, searching. You were simply being yourself. Behind the fern. In the alcove. In this conversation. You are entirely, consistently yourself. She said, Your Grace. He said, Sebastian. She said, I beg your pardon. He said, if we are having this particular conversation, in this gallery, with 17 minutes left before your deadline, I would prefer you use my name. A silence. She said, Sebastian. He said, yes. She said, what are you saying? He looked at her. The candlelight moved over his face and she saw in it something she had not expected to see in the face of any man this evening, let alone this one, sincerity, without performance, without the management of an impression. He said, I am saying that I have been looking for an interesting problem for 11 years. He paused. And I believe I may have found one standing behind a fern. Beatrice Calloway stood in the gallery of Lady Fenwick's house with the masquerade ball audible below them and 14 minutes left before midnight and looked at the Duke of Ashmore, who was looking back at her. She said, you can't be serious. He said, I find I am entirely serious. Which surprises me as much as it does you. She said, you don't know me. He said, I know you prefer truth to performance. I know you have more courage than sense, which I consider an asset rather than a liability. I know you would rather address a fern honestly than a ballroom dishonestly. He paused. I consider these to be significant things. She said, they are not things one typically leads within a proposal. He said, I am not proposing. Not tonight. He looked at her steadily. I am asking whether you would like more time. She said, more time. He said, more time. Not midnight. Not your father's deadline. More time to know whether the interesting problem I have found is the same one you were looking for. The clock in the gallery began, at that precise moment, to chime midnight. They stood and listened to it together, the 12 strokes ringing out over the murmur of the ball below. On the 12th stroke Beatrice said, very quietly, you did that on purpose. He said, I did not control the clock. She said, you controlled the conversation. He said, yes. That I did. A very long silence. She said, I think, Sebastian, that you are considerably more dangerous than you appear. He said, and I think you are considerably braver than you believe. Below them the ball continued. The clock was silent. The candles moved. She said, more time. He said, yes. She said, how much more? He said, as much as you need. He paused. I am not going anywhere. She looked at him for a long, steady moment, and felt the deadline that had been sitting on her chest like a stone since the 1st of April shift, fractionally, and then lift. If you have stayed this far, and I think you know why you have, then you understand that what is happening between Beatrice and Sebastian is not a fairy tale. It is something more interesting than that. It is two people deciding, in real time, whether the terrifying thing is worth the risk. If this story is finding you in a moment when you understand exactly how Beatrice felt in that alcove, out of time, out of options, and talking honestly to the first thing that would listen, then this channel is for you. Every story told here is about women who refused to be managed, and the men who were not prepared for that, and what happened when those two things met. Subscribe now. The next part of this story begins in 60 seconds. If you leave now, you will always wonder how it ends. He called on her father the following morning. Beatrice did not know this until after it had happened, which would later be a point of considerable discussion between them, but which in the moment produced in her a reaction she could not immediately classify, something between relief and outrage and a third thing she was not ready to name. Sir Edmund Calloway, the baronet, was a man who had spent 20 years making bad decisions with good intentions and had arrived at his current situation with the particular bewilderment of someone who had never quite connected his actions to their consequences. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who loved his daughters and could not afford to love them adequately, and had decided that the solution to the first problem was to accept Sir Phineas Grubb's terms. When the Duke of Ashmore was announced in his study at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 16th of May, Sir Edmund sat behind his desk and tried to arrange his face into the expression of a man who received dukes regularly and found it entirely unremarkable. He did not entirely succeed. The Duke sat down without waiting to be invited, which Sir Edmund found either rude or simply the prerogative of a man with his own particular gravity, and said, "I wish to speak to you about your daughter." Sir Edmund said, "Which one?" The Duke said, "Beatrice." Sir Edmund said, with the careful expression of a man calculating rapidly, "I see." The Duke said, "I understand you have made an arrangement with Sir Phineas Grubb." Sir Edmund said, "I have made a provisional arrangement, contingent on." The Duke said, "I would like you to unmake it." Sir Edmund stared at him. "I beg your pardon. I would like you to decline Sir Phineas Grubb's offer and give me the remainder of the season to demonstrate that a better arrangement exists." He said this without elaboration and without the softening language most men would have used, because he was not most men and he had found that directness was the only currency worth spending. Sir Edmund said, "Your Grace, I am not certain I understand what you are." "I am offering to clear your estate's debt now," the Duke said. "Not as a condition of marriage. As a gesture of good faith. In exchange, you give your daughter the remainder of the season to make her own choice." Sir Edmund was silent for a very long time. He said, "And if she does not choose you?" The Duke said, "Then she has been given the time she deserved to make that determination and I will have no claim on either of you." Sir Edmund said, "That is a very considerable sum of money to offer on what amounts to a chance." The Duke said, "Yes." Sir Edmund said, "May I ask why?" The Duke was quiet for a moment. "Because," he said finally, "your daughter spoke the truth about her situation when she believed no one was listening, and I find that I am not willing to allow a man who smells of camphor to be the consequence of her honesty." A silence. Sir Edmund said, "How do you know about the camphor?" The Duke said, "That is between myself and the fern." Sir Edmund stared at him for a very long time. Then, with the expression of a man who has encountered something he does not entirely understand but is intelligent enough to receive correctly, he said, "I will send word to Sir Phineas today." He did. Sir Phineas, who was 64 and had been quietly confident of the arrangement, received the news with the specific displeasure of a man unaccustomed to losing something he considered already acquired. He made 2 remarks about the situation that were unpleasant enough to confirm every one of Beatrice's instincts and be grateful for them. Beatrice was told about the Duke's visit by her father that evening. She sat with it for a full minute without speaking. Then she said, "He did not ask me." Her father said, "He asked me for the opportunity." She said, "He did not ask me." A pause. She put on her coat and her gloves and she walked to Grosvenor Square and she knocked on the front door of Ashmore House at 6 o'clock in the evening, which was not entirely proper, and was shown into the drawing-room by a butler who had the excellent professional composure of a man who had seen many things and recorded none of them. The Duke came in 2 minutes later. He stopped when he saw her. He had not expected her. She said, "You went to my father." He said, "Yes." She said, "Without asking me first?" He said, "Yes." He met her eyes. "I should have asked you first." She said, "Yes. You should have." He said, "I am asking you now." She stared at him. "I am asking whether you would like the time. Whether you would like the debt cleared and Sir Phineas declined and the remainder of the season to decide. Whether those are things you want. Not what your father wants. What you want." The drawing-room was warm and quietly furnished and entirely unlike the masquerade, and Beatrice Calloway stood in the center of it and looked at Sebastian Cavendish and understood that she was being asked a real question by a man who intended to accept whatever real answer she gave. She said, "What if I use the time and decide it is not you?" He said, "Then you have used it well and I will wish you every happiness." She said, "You would spend that money and take that risk and walk away without complaint if I chose someone else?" He said, "I would." She looked at him. She was reading his face the way she had learned, over 3 seasons, to read the faces of men who said one thing and meant another. She did not find the other thing. She found only what he said. She said, "That is either the most generous thing I have ever encountered or the most arrogant." He said, "It may be both." She recognized her own words coming back to her. Something shifted in her face. She said, "All right." He said, "All right meaning?" She said, "All right meaning I accept the time. All right meaning I will not marry Sir Phineas. All right meaning I am going to find out whether you are as interesting as you appear to be or whether this is simply a very elaborate performance." He said, "It is not a performance." She said, "I shall be the judge of that." She left. He stood in the drawing room after she had gone and felt something he could not quite name settle in his chest, like something that had been waiting to settle for a long time and had finally found the right place. The remainder of the season was, in the memory of those who observed it, the most interesting thing London had produced in at least 3 years. The Duke of Ashmore, who had attended the season for 11 years with the general enthusiasm of a man fulfilling an obligatory function, attended everything. He attended musicales and garden parties and gallery openings and afternoon calls and dinners that he would previously have declined with the polite automaticity of long practice. He was seen, repeatedly and in a variety of contexts, in the company of Miss Beatrice Calloway. He did not hover. He did not manage. He did not use the considerable weight of his presence to crowd out other possibilities, though he was aware he could have and chose not to. He simply appeared. Reliably, unhurriedly, without fanfare, as though this was simply where he preferred to be. Beatrice noticed this. She also noticed that he listened when she spoke, not the social performance of listening, the nods and the appropriate responses, but the actual thing. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered what she had said at the previous encounter and referenced it at the next. He had opinions and stated them and did not revise them simply because she disagreed, but he genuinely engaged with her disagreement rather than deflecting it. She found, to her surprise and then to her deepening lack of surprise, that she looked forward to seeing him. Not with the fluttery, destabilizing looking forward of infatuation, but with something quieter and more structural, the way you look forward to a thing that has become part of the reliable architecture of your days. She tested him. She did this deliberately and without apology, because she was the kind of woman who tested things and she had no intention of pretending otherwise. She disagreed with him publicly at Lady Hartley's dinner, about the question of women's education, and she was direct and unqualified in her disagreement, and she watched to see what he did. He listened. He amended his position on 2 specific points. He maintained it on a third and explained why with clarity and without condescension. She found she respected both the amendment and the maintenance. She asked him, during a walk in St. James's Park on a Tuesday afternoon when the weather was overcast and the park was nearly empty, what he had wanted, not in a wife, not in the social arrangement of it, but in a life. What he had actually wanted before obligation and inheritance had filled the entire canvas. He was quiet for long enough that she began to think he would not answer. He said, "I wanted to know things. Not possess them. Know them." He paused. "I have a library at Ashmore Park that has 3,000 books in it, and my father read perhaps 40 of them and my grandfather perhaps 20. They collected the books because books in a duke's library are a kind of furniture." He paused again. "I have read most of them. Not because it was expected but because I could not stop." She said, "What do you read?" He said, "Everything. History. Natural science. Philosophy. Poetry, though I find most of it overlong." He looked at her. "What do you read?" She said, "Everything I am not supposed to." He said, "Such as?" She said, "Political economy. Reports from the Parliamentary Select Committees on Labor Conditions. The works of Mr. Mill. She said it without apology, watching for the flinch. There was no flinch. His expression did something that took her a moment to identify and then identified as interest, genuine, responsive, the expression of someone who has just been given a new piece of information that alters their understanding in a welcome direction. He said, "What do you think of Mill's argument on the subjection of women?" She looked at him. She said, "I think it is correct in its conclusions and somewhat cautious in its ambition." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes. I think so too." They walked for another hour. She did not notice until they had returned to the park gate that it had begun to rain and neither of them had suggested leaving. She tested him once more. She told him the full truth of her family's situation, not the polished social version, not the carefully managed narrative, but the actual arithmetic. The actual debt. The actual decisions her father had made and their actual consequences. She told him sitting in Lady Fenwick's garden on a Wednesday afternoon with the sun going behind clouds and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, because she was not certain she could say it while looking at him. When she finished there was a silence. He said, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "I needed you to know the real version before." She stopped. He said, "Before?" She looked at him. She said, "Before I tell you that I have been looking, for 3 seasons, for someone who would find me interesting. Not manageable. Not convenient." She stopped. "Not decorative." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I find," she stopped again. She said it directly, because she had never been able to maintain dishonesty for long and had stopped trying, "I find that you do. Find me interesting." He said, "Yes. I do." She said, "And I find that you are," she searched. "That you are someone whose mind I cannot predict. Which is the rarest thing I have encountered." She paused. "And that I look forward to being in the same room as you, which I did not expect." He said, "Beatrice." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to ask your father for permission to court you formally. With your permission to ask his." She said, "That is a considerable amount of asking permission for a duke." He said, "You told a fern that you wanted some say in the matter. I am attempting to give it to you." She looked at him. The sun came back from behind the clouds. The garden was warm and quiet and entirely unhurried. She said, "Ask him." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." She paused. "And Sebastian," she paused again. "The fern sends its regards." He looked at her with the specific expression she had come to understand was his version of delight, not loud, not performed, but entirely real, visible in the way his eyes changed and the particular quality of the stillness in his face when something landed exactly right. He said, "Tell it I am in its debt." They were engaged by the 1st of June. Sir Edmund Calloway, who had done perhaps the best thing of his recent life when he had accepted the Duke's terms and sent word to Sir Phineas, cried at the announcement in a way that was embarrassing and entirely forgivable. Sir Phineas Grubb made a remark that was ungracious and confirmed, for the final time, that Beatrice's instincts had been entirely correct from the beginning. Lady Fenwick claimed credit for the entire affair on the grounds that she had positioned the fern specifically, which was not true but which she maintained with the conviction of a woman who understood that the best stories are the ones where everyone is pleased with their own role. Harcourt told the Duke, over a glass of port at their club, that he had always known it would end this way. The Duke said, "You absolutely did not." Harcourt said, "I knew the moment you described the camphor." The Duke said, "You knew the moment I described the camphor that I was going to marry her." Harcourt said, "I knew the moment you described the camphor that you were going to do something irrevocable and that for once in your life it was exactly the right thing to do." The Duke of Ashmore looked into his port glass and thought about a woman standing behind a fern addressing her most honest prayer to the ceiling of a gallery in the full and earnest belief that no one was listening. He thought about what it cost to say a true thing when you were afraid of being heard. He thought about how he had spent 11 years in rooms full of people performing at each other and had not, until this season, understood what he was missing. He said, she asked for a husband before midnight. Harcourt said, and? He said, I intend to be a very long answer to a very short question. And that is where we leave them, not at the wedding, not at the grand gesture, but here, in the small true moment of two people who said the real thing and found the real thing waiting on the other side of it. If this story stayed with you, if Beatrice's voice behind the fern felt like something you recognized, then this channel is where you belong. Every week, a new story. Every story, a woman who told the truth when it cost her something, and a man who was not prepared for what that truth would do to him. Subscribe. Leave a comment telling me which moment in this story cracked you open the most. Share this with the person in your life who needs to hear that honest and desperate is not the same as without hope. The next story starts right here.